3 days after my father died, my husband quit his job. Why keep working? Your inheritance is enough for both of us. Then he told his mother, I'll buy you a house, and promised his sister $200,000. I let them talk. Then the estate attorney called. 3 days after my father died, I walked into the kitchen at 10:30 in the morning and found my husband drinking coffee in his sweatpants. I stopped with one hand still on the doorframe. Why are you home? Trent looked up from his laptop like I'd asked something faintly amusing. Morning to you too. It's Tuesday. I know what day it is. For half a second I actually thought maybe he'd taken bereavement leave. Dad's funeral wasn't until Saturday, and I'd spent that entire morning arguing with a florist about whether my father, a man who considered a throw pillow a personal insult, would have wanted an arrangement called Peaceful Journey. Then I noticed Trent's company laptop bag wasn't slung over the kitchen chair where it lived every single morning of our marriage. Did something happen at work? He closed the laptop. I quit. I actually looked behind me as though there might be a second husband somewhere in the house who could explain what the one standing in front of me had just said. You what? I resigned. When? Yesterday. He took a sip of coffee like the word cost him nothing. Trent, don't make it sound like you switched insurance providers. Normally that would have made him laugh. Trent had always been good at sliding a joke into an uncomfortable moment. 24 years of marriage, and it had talked him out of more trouble than either of us would probably admit out loud. That morning it didn't land at all. Why would you quit your job the day after my father died? He leaned back against the counter. Because I don't see the point anymore. The point is generally the paycheck. You know what I mean. No, I really don't. He studied my face for a second. The way you study something you expect to eventually agree with you, and then he said it as casually as if he'd announced we didn't need the second car anymore. Why keep working, Nora? Your inheritance is enough for both of us. I just stared at him. My father had been dead 61 hours. I still had his last voicemail on my phone because I hadn't been able to make myself delete it. 12 seconds of him telling me not to bother driving up Sunday, that he was tired and going to bed early, the most ordinary message in the world, the last one he'd ever leave me. There were sympathy cards stacked on the counter next to the coffee maker. His obituary was still open in a browser tab on my laptop, and my husband had apparently already retired. What inheritance? Trent gave me a look, the one that meant he thought I was being deliberately difficult. Come on, Nora. Your dad sold Bellamy Fire and Safety for millions. The house is paid off. He's had investments sitting untouched for years. How much do you think you're getting? I don't know exactly. Then how do you know it's enough for you to quit? He hesitated, just slightly, and that hesitation bothered me more than whatever answer came after it. Even being conservative, it's got to be $4 million easily. I remember thinking conservatively. He'd done math. I hadn't even done math. I knew Dad had done well. I knew he'd sold the company 7 years earlier, that he lived like a man who still remembered rationing coupons even though he hadn't needed to for decades. But we had never once sat down and discussed what I'd actually inherit. My father talked more openly about his blood pressure than his bank accounts, and that's saying something, because he complained about his blood pressure constantly. Trent reached for my hand. Look, I've worked since I was 25. I'm 56. 31 years of quotas and airports and regional meetings and clients calling me on a Sunday because a compressor unit sounds funny. Maybe we finally get to actually enjoy our lives. There was something in that I understood. Trent had been tired for years, genuinely bone-deep tired, the kind that outlasts a good vacation. But understanding why somebody does a thing doesn't automatically make the thing reasonable. You quit without talking to me. I knew you'd worry. That isn't a defense. I was going to tell you. You did tell me, after. He sighed, the specific sigh that meant a conversation had gone on longer than he'd budgeted for. Can we not do this right now? I almost laughed. Apparently right now was an inappropriate time to relitigate a decision he'd made because my father had just died. Between that conversation and the family dinner that same evening, I had exactly 6 hours to myself, and I want to tell you what I did with them, because I think it matters. I didn't call anyone. I didn't research trust law or storm off to see a lawyer, not yet. I drove to my father's house, alone, and sat in his driveway for the better part of an hour without going inside, because I wasn't ready to be in those rooms yet, but I needed to be near them. I thought about the two of them together, my father and my husband, in a way I never had before that morning. Two men who'd known each other for over 2 decades, who'd shared a table at every holiday, every birthday, every ordinary Sunday dinner I could remember. And who had, apparently, at some point I hadn't been present for, formed an entire private understanding about my future that never once required my input. I didn't yet know about the letter, or the 9-month-old investment plan, or any of what was coming in the weeks ahead. I only knew, sitting in that driveway with the engine ticking as it cooled, that something fundamental had shifted underneath a marriage I'd assumed was standing on solid ground, and that I had absolutely no idea yet how deep the shift actually went. I drove home in time to help set the table for a dinner I did not yet know was going to end with my mother-in-law picking out a zip code. That evening, Trent's mother and sister came over. Paula brought a casserole. Jenna brought a bottle of Pinot Noir with a bow still stuck to the neck of it, like she'd grabbed it straight off a gift table somewhere. For the first 20 minutes, everything felt almost ordinary. We talked about the funeral flowers, about which second cousins were flying in from where, about how the pastor had asked Trent to say a few words even though he'd only met my father a handful of times. Then Trent started spending my father's money. Paula was in the middle of complaining about another rent increase at her building. This was the third one in 4 years, she said, and she didn't understand how a woman on a fixed income was supposed to keep up. When Trent said, "Easy as anything, don't worry about it, Mom, once everything clears, I'll get you into a house," I looked up from my plate. Paula blinked. "Trent, I'm serious." "So am I." "Oh, honey, I couldn't let you do that." Then, without much of a pause at all, she added, "Though there are some sweet little ranch houses out past Fairmont, if you were serious." That was when I understood this conversation had already happened at least once before, somewhere I hadn't been in the room. Jenna smiled into her wineglass. "Look at Mom. She's already picked a zip code." "I've looked," Paula said. "That doesn't mean anything." Trent laughed, the warm, easy laugh that had made me fall for him at 28. And then he turned to his sister. "And we'll get you straightened out, too." Jenna set down her fork. "What does that mean?" "The Fresno property thing, the debt from the shop, I'll cover it, a clean slate." "Trent, are you serious?" "Completely." She got up and hugged him across the back of his chair. I sat there holding my water glass, watching my husband redistribute a fortune that hadn't even cleared probate. And nobody, not one person at that table, had asked me a single question. Not how I was doing, not what my father's estate actually looked like, not what I might want to do with any part of it. They had gone directly to distribution, like grief was a formality standing between them and the good part. "Trent!" He looked at me. "What?" "My father hasn't even been buried yet." The table went quiet. His smile faded a little around the edges. "Nora, that's not what this is." "What is it then?" "I'm talking about taking care of family." I looked from him to his mother, then to his sister. "Whose family?" Paula looked down at her plate. Jenna sat back in her chair like the air had gone out of the room. Trent's jaw tightened. "That's unnecessary." "So was promising $200,000 nobody asked me about." Jenna raised both hands. "I don't want to be in the middle of this." That struck me as an interesting thing to say from someone who had accepted the offer approximately 40 seconds earlier. I didn't point that out. Not pointing things out was something I was very good at back then. After they left, Trent followed me into the kitchen while I wrapped the leftover casserole. "You embarrassed my mother." "I embarrassed your mother?" "She already feels strange accepting help. You made it worse." She seemed to recover fairly quickly. "Nora," I set the foil down, "you had no right to promise either of them anything. We're married." "What does that have to do with promising your sister $200,000? He rubbed his forehead the way he did when he thought I was being unreasonable on purpose. "If your dad left you what I think he did, we're talking about more money than we'll ever spend in 2 lifetimes. That still doesn't answer my question, because you're turning this into something it isn't." "What is it then?" He gave a short, tired laugh. "Nora, there isn't going to be a your money and my money situation here. We're set." I didn't answer. Maybe because I was exhausted. Maybe because some part of me was doing what I had done for 24 years, quietly deciding whether a thing was worth a real fight or whether it was one of the small irritations you're supposed to just let slide if you want a marriage to survive the decades. Trent had always been generous. Sometimes with things that weren't entirely his to be generous with. He'd once lent my car to Jenna for the better part of a week, and told me about it after the fact as an afterthought, the same way you'd mentioned you'd rearrange the pantry. When his mother's furnace died one January, he promised her we'd cover it before he'd said a word to me. He'd volunteered our house for Easter so many years running that one year I found out only because Paula called to ask what time she should bring the ham. None of those things taken on their own had ever seemed like much. Marriage is full of small irritations, and if you stay in one long enough, you learn that not every hill is worth planting a flag on. At least, that's what I'd told myself for a very long time. The next morning, my phone rang while I was standing in my father's closet, trying to decide which of his 3 navy suits he should be buried in. Which is a genuinely absurd thing to have to decide, and I resented every second of it. "Nora, it's Preston Ray, your father's attorney." We exchanged the usual condolences, the kind that never fit the size of the thing they're meant to address. Then Preston said, "There are several estate matters your father wanted me to go through with you directly. Could you come in tomorrow morning?" "Of course, Trent can come with me." There was a pause. Not a long one, long enough. "Actually," Preston said, "your father specifically asked that our first meeting be with you alone." I looked through the closet doorway into the living room, where Trent was sitting on the couch with his laptop open to a listing for a used pontoon boat. And for the first time since my father died, I found myself wondering exactly what he had known that I didn't. Preston Ray's office occupied the 3rd floor of an old brick building downtown, the kind of place with narrow hallways and a lobby directory that looked like it had outlasted several mayoral administrations. I'd been there twice before with Dad, once after Mom died, once when he sold the company. Neither visit had left me eager to go back a 3rd time. Preston met me at the door himself. "Nora," he shook my hand, then seemed to think better of the formality halfway through, and gave my shoulder a brief squeeze instead. "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you." He led me into his office, where a legal pad waited on the table beside a bottle of water and a box of tissues, positioned with the kind of discretion that told me he'd done this exact arrangement many times before. I noticed the tissues and decided immediately I wasn't going to need them. Grief makes you strangely competitive about the smallest things. We spent a few minutes on the ordinary business of dying, the funeral, the death certificate, what needed to happen with the house. Then Preston closed the folder in front of him. "Before we get into numbers, there's something your father wanted me to discuss with you first." "Okay. Did Trent ever mention that he came to see your father alone?" That wasn't remotely the question I'd braced for. "Trent? When? About 9 months ago?" I shook my head. "No." Preston nodded slowly, like the answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "He reached out to your father more than once. There was an in-person conversation, a follow-up call, and eventually an email." "About what? Your father's estate?" I sat back in my chair. My husband discussed my father's estate with him. "Your father asked me to be careful how I characterize the conversations. Trent wasn't threatening anyone. He wasn't attempting anything illegal." "That almost makes it worse. What was he doing?" Preston opened another folder and slid a single page across the table. It was a photocopy of a letter in my father's handwriting. Blocky, deliberate capital letters. Dad wrote like he expected every note he ever made might someday be entered into evidence somewhere. "Your father authorized me to give you this after his death." I read the first few lines. Dad had written that Trent came by one afternoon in the fall and started talking about retirement. Nothing alarming at first, since Trent complained about his job constantly and always had. Then I reached a paragraph and stopped. Dad had written the exchange down almost word for word. Trent had said, "Once Nora inherits, I can finally stop working." Dad had answered, "Nora inherits," and Trent had laughed. "Come on, Emmett, we're married." I read it twice. Preston waited. That bothered him, I said. It wasn't really a question. "Yes, why didn't he say something to me?" "We'll get to that." I looked back at the page. What bothered me most was how precisely it matched what Trent had said in our kitchen 3 days ago. "There isn't going to be a your money and my money situation." Apparently that particular idea hadn't arrived the morning after my father died. It had been sitting there, fully formed, for the better part of a year. Preston opened the estate folder. "Your father did extremely well when he sold Bellamy Fire and Safety. He invested conservatively afterward. After charitable gifts, estate expenses, and the specific provisions in his plan, the assets intended primarily for you are currently valued at approximately $4.2 million, not including the house." I don't remember having any dramatic reaction to that number. Mostly I thought, Trent wasn't far off, and I hated that thought immediately. "The majority of those assets," Preston continued, "are held in a trust your father established roughly a year before his death." "A trust for me? You're the primary beneficiary." "What does that mean in practical terms?" "It means you're financially secure for the rest of your life. The trust can provide income and distributions for housing, health expenses, retirement planning, general welfare. It was never designed to put you on an allowance." "Good, because I'm 53 years old." Preston allowed himself a small smile. Your father made essentially the same point, in almost those exact words. That sounded like him. The unusual part, Preston went on, is that for the first 5 years, any extraordinary distribution of principal requires approval from an independent corporate trustee. Extraordinary meaning what? A large gift to another person would certainly qualify. A major speculative investment might. Funding several $100,000 into a relative's debt or a relative's business would almost certainly require sign-off. I stared at him. So my father put a stranger between me and my own money because of Trent. Preston took his time answering, partly I think because he could see it landing badly. Your father was concerned about pressure, that's the word he used. That word irritates me, not at you, at him. I'm not 12 years old. No, he could have just talked to me, he could have. Instead he built a financial fence around me. Preston leaned back. Would you like to hear how your father explained it himself? I nodded, and he turned to the second page of the letter. Dad had written that he didn't know for certain whether Trent would ever actually pressure me, that Trent had been a good husband in plenty of ways, and that 24 years of marriage meant considerably more than one uncomfortable conversation about money. Then came a line that sounded so completely like him I could practically hear him clearing his throat before saying it out loud. I don't want to leave Nora my opinion of her husband, along with my money. I stopped there for a moment. Preston said quietly, he didn't want you spending whatever time you had left with him defending Trent to his face. There was one more line in that letter I haven't told you about yet, tucked near the very end. He'd written, I trust you to figure out the right answer here far more than I trust myself to guess it for you from wherever I end up next. I don't know what I believe about wherever he ended up next exactly, in any theological sense. But I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else in that whole file, because it's the truest description I've ever read of what it actually means to respect someone. Not deciding for them, even when you're certain you know best. Simply making sure they have what they need to decide for themselves, and then getting out of the way. That one landed harder than the rest of it, because he knew me. I probably would have done exactly that. He wasn't trying to make a decision about your marriage, Preston said. He wanted to make sure nobody could rush you into one about the money. I finally reached for one of the tissues I'd decided I wasn't going to need. Preston had the decency not to mention it. I want to back up for a moment and tell you about the funeral itself, because I've noticed, telling it this way, that the argument with Trent has crowded out something that deserves its own space, which is that my father actually died, and I was actually grieving him, underneath and around, and sometimes despite everything else happening in that house. The service was held that Saturday, at the same Lutheran church where my parents had married 51 years earlier. I gave the eulogy. I'd written 3 different drafts over 2 sleepless nights, and in the end I threw all 3 away and simply talked, standing at that podium, about the 4 tape measures, about how my father had taught me to drive a stick shift in a church parking lot not unlike that one, about the specific way he cleared his throat before saying anything he considered important, which I'd heard exactly twice in the letter Preston would later show me, and recognized instantly both times. Trent sat beside me in the front pew, and I want to be fair here because fairness has always mattered to me even when it's inconvenient. He held my hand through the whole service. He cried genuinely when the pastor read the passage my father had specifically requested, something from Ecclesiastes about there being a time for every purpose under heaven, which Dad had always found more comforting than anything more explicitly hopeful, because he distrusted false comfort roughly as much as he distrusted anyone in a hurry to get his signature on something. Trent's grief that day was real. I've never once doubted that. It simply turned out to be sitting right alongside a set of plans he'd already built, quietly, for 8.5 more months than I knew about. At the reception afterward, in the church basement with its folding tables and someone's aunt's lemon bars, half the county's small business owners came through the line to tell me what my father had meant to them. A plumbing contractor who said Dad had extended him 30 days on an invoice once, no questions, when a client had stiffed him first. A woman who'd worked the front desk at Bellamy for 11 years, and cried harder than almost anyone else in the room. I stood there for 2 hours shaking hands and accepting casseroles, and somewhere in the middle of it, I remember looking across the room and seeing Trent deep in conversation with his mother. And some old instinct in me noted it and filed it away as nothing, the same way I'd filed away 100 small things over 24 years. It wasn't nothing. It was, I would learn only days later, the conversation where he first mentioned the word house. I don't say that to make the funeral into another chapter of the argument. I say it because that's genuinely how it happened. grief and greed occupying the exact same room, the exact same afternoon, wearing the exact same black suit, and it took me considerably longer than it should have to separate the two. There were nights that first month when none of it was about Trent at all. I'd be doing something completely unrelated, folding laundry, waiting at a red light, and it would simply arrive the way grief does, uninvited and total. I'd remember that I could no longer call him on a Sunday to ask why my check engine light was on, a question I'd asked him roughly 400 times over the years, and which he'd answered patiently every single time, usually by driving over and looking at it himself rather than actually explaining anything. I'd remember the specific sound of his voice saying my name, which is a sound I now understand, with the particular late knowledge grief specializes in, that I will genuinely never hear again in this world. I saw a grief counselor twice that spring, separately from the marriage counseling that came later. And she told me something I've held on to since. She said most people expect grief to feel like sadness, and it does, but it also frequently feels like anger and confusion, and a strange, disorienting clarity about things that have nothing directly to do with the person you lost. Sometimes, she said, losing a parent is what finally gives people the nerve to look, clearly, at everything else in their life they'd been avoiding looking at too closely. Not because the grief caused the marriage to have problems, because the grief removed whatever had been letting you look away from problems that were already there. I thought about that for a long time. I think it's the truest single thing anybody said to me that entire year, including everything in Preston, as office, including everything my father wrote down in his own careful, blocky capital letters. When I got home, Trent was in the kitchen. He'd showered and changed, which almost made me feel better, until his first word was, "So?" I set my purse down. "So what?" He gave me an impatient look. "Nora, what did Preston say?" "There's a trust." His expression changed immediately. "How much?" I looked at him. He corrected himself, a beat too late to matter. "I mean, what are the terms?" "No, you meant how much." "Okay, fine, how much? I'm not discussing numbers today." "Why?" "Because I'm still planning my father's funeral, Trent." That stopped him for maybe 3 seconds. Then he asked, "How long until it pays out?" "It doesn't work like that." "What does that mean?" I explained the basics, not everything, just enough. Trent paced once across the kitchen. "So we need approval to use our own money." "My inheritance," he turned. "Seriously, that's what it is now." "Can we borrow against it?" "I don't know." "Did you ask?" "No." He exhaled sharply. "Nora, I already quit." There it was, not I made a mistake, not I should have talked to you first, I already quit, as though his own decision had generated an invoice, and I was the one now responsible for paying it. That night I went to bed early. Sometime after 1 I woke up thirsty and headed downstairs. I heard Trent before I reached the bottom step. He was in the den speaking quietly into his phone. "No, don't panic." A pause. "The money exists, it's just tied up." A pause I recognized by its length as Jenna's turn to talk. He lowered his voice further. "I'll figure it out." Another pause. Then he said something I can still hear exactly as he said it. "Nora will come around." I stood halfway down the staircase in the dark. Normally, I would have walked straight in. I would have demanded to know what he meant by that. And we would have argued until 2 in the morning, and eventually one of us would have apologized just to make it stop. Instead, I turned around and went back upstairs, because for once in 24 years, I didn't want Trent to know what I knew. I wanted to hear what he said when he was certain I wasn't listening. The next morning I made coffee and asked Trent, not angrily, what exactly he'd promised everybody. The not angrily part seemed to bother him more than anger would have. He was standing at the counter spreading peanut butter on toast when I said, "Besides the house for your mother and the money for Jenna, what else?" He stopped mid-spread. "What? What else have you planned, Trent?" "It's 7 in the morning." "I know." He set the knife down. "Are we really doing this again? I don't think we ever finished it the first time." He stared at me for a moment, then pulled out a chair. "Fine, what do you want to know?" "Everything." He leaned back and crossed his arms, and then, unprompted, he told me. "A lake place." Nothing ridiculous in his words. Maybe somewhere out past Alder Lake. Close enough to use on weekends. He wanted to invest enough that we could live comfortably without ever touching much principal. He wanted to help his mother, help Jenna get back on her feet, maybe spend January and February somewhere that had never heard of a wind chill advisory. Listening to him was strange, because none of it sounded terrible in isolation. I'd complained about Wisconsin winters for 2 decades. I liked lakes. I wanted Paula to feel secure. I didn't enjoy watching Jenna struggle. The problem was that Trent had built an entire future for both of us, without once asking whether I wanted to live inside it. Anything else? No. You're sure? Yes. I took a sip of coffee. When did you quit? I told you Monday. No. When did you actually decide to resign? He looked toward the window. That was answer enough. Trent, the morning after my father died? I sent the resignation in Tuesday morning. We'd already discussed it. I caught that. My boss and I already discussed. Discussed what? He rubbed his face. Me leaving. When? A few weeks ago. For a second neither of us spoke. My father had still been alive a few weeks ago. Nora, you were already talking about retirement while my father was still alive? I was talking about options based on what he stood to leave us. Don't do this. Do what? Make it ugly. I almost couldn't believe that one. I'm not making anything ugly, I'm asking you a question. You're making it sound like I was sitting around waiting for my father-in-law to die. Were you? No. The answer came fast enough that I believed it, but then he added, your dad was 81, Nora. He was sick. We all knew what was coming. I stared at him. Trent seemed to hear it as it left his mouth. That's not what I meant. Then help me out. He walked to the sink and turned around, gripping the edge of the counter behind him. I've worked 31 years, Nora. 31. I've missed birthdays because some distributor in Green Bay couldn't wait until Monday. I've spent half my adult life eating scrambled eggs off a hotel breakfast bar. I'm tired. I know you're tired. Do you? Because your father got to sell his company and walk away with his whole life still ahead of him. He had choices. There was something in his voice I'd heard before but never really examined. Resentment. Not toward Dad specifically. Toward what Dad represented. I don't own a company, Trent went on. I don't have some enormous retirement package, so when it became obvious we'd have enough, he closed his eyes. Here we go again. No, answer me. When did my father's estate become your retirement account? He grabbed his keys off the counter. I can't talk to you when you're like this. That almost made me smile. He was unemployed. I had no idea where he thought he was storming off to, but apparently he had somewhere very important to be. I didn't stop him. Over the next 2 days I started discovering exactly how far his plans had already traveled. First came an email on our shared account from a real estate agent thanking us for our continued interest in the Alder Lake property. I called the number in the signature. Trent had put down a refundable deposit of $6,500 from our joint checking account 4 days before my father died. That evening, Paula called and mentioned, almost as an aside, that she'd told her landlord she probably wouldn't be renewing her lease when it came up in 4 months. Then Jenna called. She wanted to know if I had any idea when things might clear. What things? A pause. You know, the estate. Why? Another pause, longer this time. I've been talking to one of my creditors. Trent said I shouldn't lock myself into a long repayment plan if I'm going to be able to settle it soon anyway. I sat at my desk staring at the wall for a long moment after we hung up. Trent hadn't merely made promises. People had already begun making real decisions based on them. When he came home I told him about both calls. He didn't look particularly alarmed. We'll sort it out. You told Jenna to stop negotiating her own debt. I told her not to lock herself into something stupid. And your mother thinks she's moving. She probably is. Trent, you didn't just spend money we don't have, you changed other people's actual lives with it. We do have it. I looked at him. I have it. His face hardened. There it is. There what is? Your money, yes. You've never talked like this before. Because you've never promised away hundreds of thousands of dollars I inherited from my dead father before. He shook his head. Your dad really got what he wanted with that trust. That did it. Don't blame my father for the fact that you quit your job. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. The next morning I called Preston. I need to know something. Was that conversation with my father the only time Trent talked about the estate? Preston was quiet for a beat. No. So I went back downtown. This time there were no tissues on the table, or maybe there were and I simply didn't notice them. Preston opened a file. Your father authorized the release of this material to you after his death. I want to be clear about that up front. He slid several printed pages toward me. The first had a title across the top, The Kessler-Bellamy Family Investment Plan. I actually gave a short, ugly laugh. Not because anything about it was funny, but because my husband had apparently given my father's eventual death a business plan title, complete with both our surnames, like a merger. I turned the page. Estimated investment returns. A proposed lake property, housing assistance for Paula. A section labeled, Jenna, business debt resolution, $175,000 to $200,000. Then retirement projections for Trent, laid out year by year like a pension statement. I kept reading. My father's estimated estate value appeared in 3 separate places. So did my name, Nora's expected inheritance, Nora's projected assets, Nora's anticipated investment income. I flipped back to the first page. What's the date on this? Preston didn't answer right away. He didn't need to. It was sitting right there in the upper corner, small and precise, the way Trent formatted everything. 9 months before my father died. I sat back in the chair. 9 months. Not 3 days after. Not grief, not panic. Not some rash decision made by an exhausted man stumbling out of a funeral. Trent had been designing this entire future, while my father was still driving himself to the hardware store to complain about property taxes. Still calling me every Sunday evening to ask whether I'd remember to rotate my tires. I went through the pages again, more slowly this time. Then something else struck me. Preston, there's nothing in here about what I wanted. He didn't say anything. There's no section about whether I plan to retire. Nothing about what I might want to do with any of it. Nothing about my father's causes, the scholarship fund he cared about, keeping it invested, any of it. I looked up. I'm everywhere in these pages, and somehow I'm not in them at all. Preston finally asked, "Are you all right?" No. It was the easiest honest answer I'd given all week. I closed the folder. But I finally understand why my father was worried. Before I left, I told Preston one thing clearly. I don't want any of the inheritance transferred into our joint accounts. Not checking, not savings, not property, nothing. We can make sure everything is handled carefully, and I'm not requesting any distributions right now. Preston nodded. For now. I thought about that phrase the entire drive home. That evening, Trent was waiting in the kitchen. Did you talk to the trustee? Yes. He straightened. And? I'm not requesting the money. His expression changed. Any of it? Not for your mother's house. Not for Jenna. Not for the lake property. He stared at me. For the first time since my father died, Trent didn't look irritated, and he didn't look offended either. He looked frightened. And that was when I understood something else entirely. Until that exact moment, he had never actually believed I might say no. Trent didn't speak to me for the rest of that evening. Not exactly. He asked whether I'd fed the dog. He mentioned the dishwasher was clean. At 9:30 he stood in the doorway of the den and said, "I'm going to bed." We were apparently still capable of running a household together. We simply couldn't discuss the fact that he'd retired on money that wasn't his to spend. The next morning, I overheard him calling his old boss. I wasn't trying to listen. Our house wasn't large enough for a 56-year-old man to have a private career crisis in the kitchen with any real privacy. "I'm not asking you to pretend I never resigned," Trent said. "I'm asking whether there's any way to reverse it." A long silence. "I understand." Another silence. "Yeah, of course." When he hung up, he stayed at the table. I asked what his old boss had said. "My position's already been offered to Grady." I knew Grady. Trent had complained about him for 6 years straight. That was fast. Apparently Grady doesn't need 3 weeks to think it over. I let that sit. Trent looked at me. "They might have something else later. Probably less money." "Okay." He gave a humorless laugh. "You don't have to sound so devastated." "What do you want me to say?" "I don't know. Maybe that we'll figure this out together." I set my coffee down. "We can figure out what happens next together. We cannot pretend the quitting itself was a decision we made together." That distinction became the argument underneath every argument we had for the next week. Trent wanted me to request enough from the trust to replace 2 years of his salary while he figured out his next move. I said no. I wasn't threatening to stop paying the mortgage or buying groceries. I had my own income from the physical therapy practice, my own savings, and we'd always split household expenses fairly. What I wouldn't do was turn my father's estate into severance pay for a resignation I hadn't been told about until after it happened. There was one moment, about 5 weeks into all of this, when Trent came dangerously close to doing something that would have made the eventual divorce considerably uglier than it turned out to be. Preston called me on a Thursday afternoon, his voice carrying a note of caution I hadn't heard from him before. "I need to tell you something before you hear it secondhand," he said. "Trent contacted our office directly yesterday. He asked whether he could be added as an authorized inquirer on the trust. Not a distribution, just information access, so he could, in his words, stay informed about the family's financial planning. What did you tell him? I told him that request would need to come from you, in writing, and that I couldn't discuss the trust's contents with him at all without your explicit authorization, which is exactly what your father's documents specify. I sat with that for a moment. Did he push back? A little, not aggressively. He seemed to genuinely believe it was a reasonable ask. That was, in its way, the whole problem in miniature. Trent's ongoing, apparently sincere belief that reasonable and mine were interchangeable words when it came to anything connected to my father's estate. I didn't authorize the request. Preston didn't mention it to me again, which meant Trent never brought it up either. Which told me everything about how that particular conversation between the two of them had actually gone. Then Trent's mother and sister came over again. They called it talking. Family has a remarkable supply of gentle words for situations that are not gentle at all. Trent told us you're not requesting any distributions, Jenna started. I looked at Trent. He stared at the floor. That's correct. Jenna shifted on the couch. I just wish I'd known before. Before what? Before I changed things with my creditors. I didn't tell you to change anything. No, Trent did. Then Trent owes you an apology. She frowned. He's your husband, Nora. Exactly, my husband, not my father's executor. Paula stepped in before Jenna could answer. Let's not make this uglier than it needs to be. That phrase again. Apparently declining to fund everyone's plans out of my father's estate was what kept making things ugly, and not the plans themselves. I should tell you a little more about Jenna too. Because it would be easy, telling this quickly, to make her sound like nothing more than a woman who accepted $200,000 in 40 seconds flat. And that isn't the whole of who she is. Jenna is 49, 3 years younger than Trent, and she spent most of her 30s running a small interior design business out of a rented studio in Fresno, before a partnership with the wrong person collapsed and took most of her savings and a fair amount of her confidence down with it. She moved back to Wisconsin 4 years ago, close to Trent and their mother, and she's been rebuilding since. Freelance work, a few good clients, a debt load that had genuinely kept her up at night long before any of this began. I don't think Jenna set out to exploit my father's death. I think she spent 4 years watching her older brother, who she's always looked up to in a fairly uncomplicated way, present himself as a man who could simply make her problems disappear. And she believed him. The same way people generally believe the people who've never given them a specific reason not to. When she finally called me, months later, to apologize on her own, not because Trent asked her to, she was very clear about that, she said something I've turned over since. I think I wanted it to be true so badly that I stopped asking whether it was actually your decision to make. I told her I understood. I did understand. I'd spent 24 years wanting a version of my marriage to be true so badly that I'd stopped asking myself the same question about my own choices. Paula's approach was different from Jenna's. She didn't talk about entitlement. She talked about rent. Her lease had gone up twice in 3 years. She was 78, and tired of wondering whether she'd still be able to afford the same apartment at 82, and I think that particular terror comes from someplace real and specific, an actual eviction when Trent was 13, that he's mentioned exactly once in 24 years of marriage and never elaborated on, and that I've never pushed him to. Here's the part that would have been easier if I'd simply hated her. I didn't. Paula had driven me to the hospital when Sophie was born, because Trent had been 2 counties away on a sales call and hadn't made it back in time. She'd sat beside me through most of my mother's chemotherapy, years earlier, showing up with a crossword puzzle book and never once making me talk if I didn't want to. She made a truly ridiculous cranberry salad every Thanksgiving, because Sophie had loved it as a little girl, and Paula had never once let that fact go. People are inconvenient that way. They can genuinely hurt you without erasing every decent thing they've ever done. After they left, I found myself thinking about that house. Not the one Trent had promised her, just something smaller, a condo maybe, something safe and manageable. 2 days later, I sat in Preston's office and surprised myself. What if I wanted to buy Paula a place? He took off his glasses. Do you? I might. That's different from whether you can. I know. We talked numbers. Something in the range of $230,000 to $260,000 could get a modest condo in an area she liked. It would require trustee approval, but Preston thought a carefully documented, independently justified request could reasonably be considered. Then he asked me one question. Is this what you want, Nora? I didn't answer right away. I don't want her scared about housing. That wasn't my question. Lawyers can be irritatingly precise when they're good at their jobs. I don't know. Then don't submit anything today. So I didn't. And I've thanked myself for that more than once since. Paula came over the following afternoon. She didn't even take her coat off. Trent said you talked to Preston. I glanced toward the den. Trent wasn't home. He told you that? He said you might be reconsidering. I was thinking about some options. Her face brightened. A condo would actually be better than a house. Less upkeep. I hadn't mentioned a condo to her, which meant Trent had again. I felt tired, more tired than angry at that point. Paula, I haven't decided anything. Her expression shifted. I don't understand what there is to decide. Your father left you almost $4 million. There was that number again. Apparently Trent had shared that too. That's between me and my father's estate. I'm not trying to pry, she absolutely was, but I let her go on. I just think you're making decisions while you're grieving. Maybe your father made sure you'd never have to worry about money again. I waited. Then she said the rest of it. Your father can't use it anymore. What exactly are you saving it for? I looked at her. Paula must have seen something shift in my face because she softened her voice immediately. I didn't mean it that way. But there wasn't another way to mean it. Until that moment, some part of me had still believed that if I gave her the condo willingly, I could keep my generosity separate from Trent's presumption. Sitting there, I understood I couldn't. Not yet. Paula wasn't waiting to see whether I wanted to give. She was waiting for me to stop refusing. I think you should keep your current lease, I said. Her face fell. Nora, I haven't submitted anything to the trustee. She stared at me a moment longer, picked up her purse, and left. Sophie called that night. I'd been expecting it. Mom, what's going on? What did Dad tell you? That he made a stupid decision. That narrows it down. She didn't laugh. He said he retired too early because Grandpa left enough that you guys would be okay. That's one version. He also said you're talking about separate accounts and lawyers. I already have a lawyer. He handles Grandpa's estate. Mom. I heard the frustration climb in her voice. Then she said the thing I'd known someone eventually would. Dad screwed up, I know that. But are you really going to end 24 years over money? That one hurt because it came from my own daughter. No. Then what are you doing? I could have told her about the 9-month-old document sitting in a folder on my kitchen counter. I could have sent it to her right then, before we even hung up. Instead I said, I'm not asking you to choose between us. I'm not choosing. Good, but I don't understand. I sat down on the edge of the bed. I'm trying to figure out when your father started believing that being married to me meant he didn't have to ask me anymore. Sophie went quiet. We ended the call without solving anything. I should say a little more about Sophie too, since so far she's mostly appeared as a voice on the phone reacting to everyone else's decisions. She's 28, works as a high school biology teacher in Eau Claire, about 2 hours from us, and she'd been dating a man named Julian for almost 3 years by the time all of this happened. Steady, kind, unremarkable in the specific way that steady, kind men often are, which I mean is the highest compliment I know how to give. She'd been saving for a house of her own for 2 years before any of this started, methodically, the way she does everything. And some part of what made that phone call so hard for both of us was that Sophie had grown up watching her father provide generously and easily, and some part of her instinct, at 28, was still to defend the version of him she'd always known. She called me again about 10 days after that conversation, this time without any of the earlier frustration in her voice. I keep thinking about the part where your name was in there 14 times, she said, and none of it was actually about you. I know. I don't think Dad even realizes he does that. I think he genuinely believes providing for people is the same thing as asking them what they want. I told her I thought she'd just described her father more precisely than either of us had managed in 3 weeks of arguing about it. And she laughed, a little sadly, and said she'd learned that from watching me not ask for what I wanted for about as long as she could remember. That one stayed with me for weeks. That night, Trent came into the bedroom. We can't keep living like this. No, we can't. If we're married, we build a future together. I agree. Then you can't wall off almost $4 million and act like it has nothing to do with me. I looked at him. You quit your job without asking me. He opened his mouth. I kept going. You promised your mother a house without asking me. You promised your sister $200,000 without asking me. You planned your entire retirement 9 months before my father died without asking me, and now I'm supposed to prove I'm committed to this marriage. He had no answer. That was almost worse than another argument. I took my pillow off the bed. Trent watched me. What are you doing? Sleeping in the guest room? For how long? I stopped at the door. I don't know. And for once, I didn't rush to give him an answer just because he wanted one. Trent moved into the guest room before I could change my mind about taking it myself. I came home from work the next day, and found his clothes hanging in that closet, his shaving kit in the guest bathroom, and a stack of printed resumes on the desk. Neither of us mentioned it out loud. For the next few weeks, our marriage became strangely polite. "Do you need anything from the store?" "No thanks. I'm taking the dog out." "Okay, I'll be home late." Interview: "Good luck. You can live with somebody for 24 years and become courteous strangers remarkably fast. There's a particular kind of loneliness in living beside someone who used to know you completely and now only knows your schedule." During those guest room weeks, before Trent actually moved out, I caught myself, more than once, drafting things to tell him in my head out of old habit. A funny thing a patient had said at the practice. A headline that would have made him laugh. Before remembering, each time, that I wasn't sure yet whether I still wanted to be the kind of wife who saved things up to tell him. That specific loss, the loss of an audience you've had for 24 years, turned out to be harder to name than almost anything else that happened that spring, and considerably harder to explain to anyone who hadn't lived inside a marriage that long. But Trent did start changing things. He canceled the lake property contract and got the deposit back. He updated his resume with an actual template instead of the one he'd been using since 2009. He called former clients and people he'd worked with years earlier. I heard him practicing answers before phone interviews, trying to find a version of explaining why a 56-year-old man had abruptly left a perfectly good sales position that didn't involve the sentence, "Well, I assumed my father-in-law was about to finance my retirement." Most importantly, he stopped asking about the trust. At first I assumed it was strategy. Then one Saturday morning, I heard him talking to Jenna while I was in the laundry room folding towels. "No," he said, "you need to work something out with them directly." A pause. "I know what I told you." Another pause. "No. Nora didn't change her mind about anything. This isn't about Nora." I stopped folding. Trent's voice got quieter. "I shouldn't have promised you that money." I couldn't hear Jenna's answer, but I could imagine the shape of it. Then Trent said, "I know." A longer pause. "But it wasn't mine to promise." My hands went still on the towel in my lap. That sentence shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. But it was the first time I'd heard him say it that way. Not the trustee won't approve it. Not Nora won't release it. Not my father-in-law tied everything up out of spite. It wasn't mine. For the first time since my father died, I wondered whether Trent actually understood. A few days later he called his mother. "Mom, listen to me. Don't give notice on your place." Even from several feet away I could hear Paula's voice rising through the phone. Trent rubbed the back of his neck. "I know what I said." Another burst from her. "No, Nora didn't stop me." He looked over at me. I said nothing. Trent turned toward the window. "I promised you something that wasn't mine." There it was again. Paula kept talking. Eventually Trent said, "I know you're disappointed. I'm sorry, but that's on me." When he hung up, neither of us spoke for a moment. Then I said, "Thank you." He looked surprised. "For what?" "For not making me the villain." He nodded slowly. "I've done that enough already." That was probably the closest we'd come to any real tenderness in weeks, and that made what I did next considerably harder. Jenna came to see me directly, on her own, about 3 weeks after I'd overheard that phone call in the laundry room. She showed up at my door on a Tuesday evening, unannounced, which wasn't like her at all. "Can I come in?" I let her in. We sat in the kitchen, the same table, and for a while neither of us said much of anything. "Trent told me what he actually promised," she finally said. "That it wasn't ever really his to give." "That's right. I want you to know I believed him completely. I'm not saying that to make you feel sorry for me. I'm saying it because I think you deserve to know I wasn't calculating anything. I genuinely thought a wealthy man's daughter would simply have more money than she'd ever need, and that some of it coming to me wouldn't cost her anything real. It would have cost me something real. I understand that now." She turned her coffee cup slowly on the table, the same nervous habit Trent had. "I think I wanted it to be true so badly that I stopped asking whether it was actually your decision to make." I told her I understood. I did understand. I'd spent 24 years wanting a version of my marriage to be true so badly that I'd stopped asking myself the same question about my own choices. Before she left, she said one more thing. "For what it's worth, I'm proud of you for saying no. I don't think I would have managed it." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just thanked her. And she hugged me at the door briefly, the way you hug someone you're not entirely sure is still supposed to be family. I think, before I tell you about that Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table, I owe you a little more of the marriage's actual history. Because the 24 years didn't arrive at this place overnight, and I don't think it's fair to Trent, or honest of me, to make it sound like it did. I met Trent when I was 26, at a mutual friend's 4th of July cookout, and what struck me first wasn't his confidence, though he had plenty of that. It was how he talked about his own father. Trent's dad, Roland, had run a small appliance repair shop for most of Trent's childhood, and it had failed twice, once when Trent was 9 and once when he was 16, both times taking whatever savings the family had scraped together with it. Trent told me, that very first night, with a kind of raw honesty I found disarming at 26, that he'd grown up watching his father apologize for things that weren't entirely his fault, and that he'd promised himself he would never be a man his own kids had to watch apologize like that. I understood, even then, that Trent's drive wasn't really about money. It was about never again being the person in the room who couldn't fix the problem. I found that admirable. I still do, in a strange way, even now. What I didn't fully register, not for years, was how that same drive could curdle into something else entirely, once an easier path presented itself, the drive to be the fixer without any of the actual grinding effort his father's failures had cost him. My father's success didn't just hand Trent an opportunity. It handed him a shortcut around the exact thing he'd spent his whole adult life trying to prove about himself. And some part of him took it before he'd fully thought through what taking it would actually require him to become. There was an earlier version of this, if I go looking for it, back when we'd been married only 6 years. My grandmother, my mother's mother, left me a modest inheritance when she died, around $40,000, nothing close to what came later, but real money to 2 people still paying down a starter house. Trent used $11,000 of it, without asking me first, to help his father cover back rent on the repair shop's building after a slow winter. He told me about it after the fact, the same way he'd later tell me about lending my car to Jenna. As a kindness he assumed I'd have agreed to, if only he'd had time to ask. I remember being upset. I remember also deciding, at 35, that it wasn't worth the fight it would have taken to actually address it, because the shop closed for good 8 months later anyway, and by then the money was simply gone, and raising it again felt like reopening a wound that had already scarred over. I let it go. I told myself that was maturity. Looking back at it now, sitting where I sit today, I think it was actually the very first brick in a pattern I spent 18 more years building around myself without ever quite noticing the walls going up. I'm not telling you this to excuse what came later. I'm telling you because I think it matters, if you're the kind of person who tends to let the $11,000 version of a thing go, that you understand exactly what you're actually agreeing to. You are not agreeing that it was a one-time lapse. You are quietly teaching somebody you love that this is simply how the two of you operate. Trent didn't invent that lesson 40 years into our marriage. I taught it to him early, and he learned it very, very well. The following Sunday afternoon, I asked Trent to sit down with me, not in the den, not in the bedroom, at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd promised his mother a house and his sister $200,000, while my father's funeral flowers were still sitting in a vase on the counter, slowly dying. I put Preston's folder between us. Trent looked at it. "What is that?" I slid the first page across. He read the title, The Kessler-Bellamy Family Investment Plan, and his face changed. He didn't ask where I'd gotten it. That told me plenty on its own. "You sent this to my father." Trent leaned back. It was hypothetical. 9 months before he died. "Nora, yes." I opened it. "Here's your retirement projection." He said nothing. "Here's the lake property." Nothing. "Here's the money for your mother." I turned another page. "And here's $175,000 to $200,000 for Jenna." I was planning possibilities. For whose money? He rubbed his forehead. "We've done this." "No, we haven't done this." I pushed the pages toward him. "Show me." "Show you what?" "Where you asked what I wanted." He looked at me. "Nora, it's 6 pages. It shouldn't take long." He didn't touch them. So I did. I went through them page by page. "My name is here 14 times. I tapped one line. "Nora's expected inheritance." Another. "Nora's projected assets." Another. "Nora's investment income." Then I looked at him. "Where am I?" He frowned. "Your name is everywhere." "Exactly. My money is everywhere. I'm nowhere." For a while all I could hear was the refrigerator humming. Then Trent said, "I was tired." I waited. "I know that's not an excuse." "No." He looked down at the papers. "I'd been doing the same job forever. Your dad got to sell his whole company and walk away. He had the house paid off. He could help Sophie with school without checking his balance first. Dad never held that over you. I know. His answer came so quickly I believed it. That almost made it worse. I hadn't expected that. Trent gave a short, embarrassed laugh. Emmett never had to say he was more successful than me. I knew it every single time I sat at his table. I should say something here about Roland. Trent's own father, because I think he matters to understanding all of this more than he's come up so far. I met Roland exactly once, at our wedding, where he'd shown up unannounced and left before the reception ended. And Trent has spoken to him maybe 4 times total in the 24 years I've known him. I used to think that estrangement was simply about the failed shop, the lost savings, the ordinary bitterness of a childhood interrupted by financial collapse. Sitting with everything that happened after my father died, I've come to think it might be something closer to the opposite. I think Trent spent his whole life terrified of becoming a man his own children had to eventually stop calling, and in trying so hard to avoid that particular fate, he built himself into a man who couldn't stand the idea of anyone in his orbit. His mother, his sister, eventually me, ever having an unmet need he hadn't personally rushed to fill, whether or not they'd actually asked him to. I don't know if that's the whole explanation. I'm not a therapist, and Trent is the only one who can really answer that question honestly, if he ever chooses to. But it's the theory that makes the most sense to me, turning it over on nights when I still find myself, unexpectedly, missing him. You wanted to feel like my father, I said. He looked away. After a moment he said, maybe. I touched the investment plan, and you were going to use his money to do it. Trent closed his eyes. He didn't argue. That was the moment something in me settled. Not because I'd won. I didn't feel victorious sitting there. I finally understood what had happened, and understanding it made me sadder, not lighter. Trent hadn't spent 9 months plotting to rob me. He'd done something more ordinary, and in some ways more difficult to simply be angry at. He'd built an entire story in his head where my father's money quietly solved every disappointment he'd ever carried about his own life. And somewhere in the writing of that story, he'd never once noticed that I was a person inside it, not a line item. Sophie came by later that afternoon. I hadn't invited her over for a confrontation, she'd already been planning to stop by. The folder was still sitting on the table. She noticed it immediately. What is that? I looked at Trent. He nodded once, so I let her read it. Sophie went quiet for several minutes, working through the pages. Then she looked up at her father. You wrote this before Grandpa died. Trent swallowed. Yes. How long before? 9 months. She stared at him. Dad. There was more disappointment packed into that one syllable than I could have produced with an hour of yelling. Trent looked down. I know. Sophie didn't suddenly become my ally in some dramatic way. She didn't need to. She simply, finally, understood exactly what she'd been asking me to overlook on the phone a few nights earlier. After she left, Trent and I sat at the table again. I'm sorry, he said. I believed I meant well, that's the worst part of it. If he'd still been arrogant about it, the decision in front of me would have been easy. Instead, he was trying, maybe genuinely, but my father hadn't built that trust to determine whether Trent deserved forgiveness. He'd built time. And I finally knew exactly what I needed to do with some of it. My father didn't need to protect me from you with a lawyer, I said. He just gave me enough time to see what I would have talked myself out of seeing on my own. Trent looked at me. What are you saying? I need you to move out. His face went still. For how long? I don't know. Are you divorcing me? I shook my head. I haven't decided. He looked wounded, and I hated that I still cared, but I did. Then I said, and that's the first big decision in this house that nobody else gets to make for me. This time Trent didn't argue. Trent moved out the following Saturday. There was no dramatic scene, no suitcase thrown onto the lawn, no neighbors pretending not to watch through their blinds while actually watching very closely through their blinds. I want to tell you a little more about that day, because I've compressed it so far, and it deserves more than that. He started around 9 in the morning, methodical about it in a way that surprised me. Trent has never in his life been an organized packer, and yet he'd apparently spent the week before making lists, color-coded, of which boxes were going where. I sat on the porch steps for part of it, not because I needed to supervise, but because staying inside felt like hiding from something I'd chosen, and I didn't want to hide from a decision I still believed was right. Around noon he came out with a box of things from the garage. Old sales awards, a fishing rod he hadn't used in a decade, a shoebox of photographs from before I knew him, and he set it down on the porch beside me and just stood there for a second, looking at the house. I always thought I'd die in this house, he said, not dramatically, just factually the way you'd mention a change in weather. I know. I'm not saying that to make you feel guilty. I don't feel guilty. He almost smiled at that. No, I don't suppose you do anymore. That wasn't cruel the way he said it. It was closer to something like respect, arriving about 4 months too late to change anything, but arriving all the same. He picked the box back up and carried it to the car. He rented a 1-bedroom apartment about 15 minutes away, and made 3 trips in his SUV. On the last one he stood in the kitchen with his keys in his hand. "I'll leave the garage remote. You can keep it for now." He nodded. Then neither of us seemed to know what came next. 24 years of marriage, and suddenly goodbye felt strangely formal, like we'd only just met. "Call me if anything comes up with the house," he said. "I will." He left. I locked the door behind him, and then immediately felt guilty for locking it. Which is a strange thing about setting a boundary after years of avoiding them. Even when you know exactly why you're doing it, some part of you still feels rude for doing it at all. Sophie came by that evening, after he'd finished, and found me sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of wine I hadn't touched. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she sat down across from me, in the chair that had been her father's for 24 years, and said, "Are you okay?" "I don't know yet." "That's allowed." I looked at my daughter, 28 years old, offering me permission I hadn't realized I needed, and thought about how strange it is that the people we raise sometimes end up teaching us the exact lessons we spent years failing to teach them. Word travels, even when you don't particularly want it to. By early summer most of our mutual friends knew some version of what had happened, filtered through however many retellings, and I want to be honest that the reactions surprised me in both directions. A woman I'd known for 15 years through the Practices book club stopped returning my calls entirely, and I found out much later, through Carol, that she'd decided I was being punitive toward a grieving husband over money that, in her words, wasn't really going to run out. I never got the chance to explain the investment plan document to her, and I've made my peace with the fact that some people will only ever hear the headline version of a thing and build their entire opinion on it. But there were other reactions too, quieter ones, that meant more to me than I expected. A neighbor I barely knew, a widow named Patricia who lived 2 houses down, brought over a plant one Tuesday evening with no explanation beyond. "I went through something similar once, a long time ago, before restrictions like your father's were as common. I just wanted you to know somebody on this street understands exactly what that year costs a person." She left before I could even ask her to elaborate, and I've never pushed her to, the same way I've never pushed Trent about the eviction he mentioned once, and never again. The next few months weren't nearly as satisfying as people imagine these things are supposed to be. I missed him. Not every minute, and not in some noble, dignified way. Some evenings I genuinely enjoyed eating exactly what I wanted, and watching whatever I wanted without Trent asking a question halfway through a show he'd sworn he wasn't even watching. But I missed the sound of his key turning in the door at 6:15. I missed his terrible habit of leaving every single cabinet door standing open behind him. I even missed the way he sneezed like somebody'd fired off a starter pistol 2 rooms away. Missing somebody doesn't automatically mean you should go back. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to fully understand that particular distinction. I want to be honest that none of this unfolded as cleanly as it might sound, laid out for you, in order like this. There were nights that spring when I lay awake running the numbers Preston had given me, over and over. Not because I doubted them, but because some old, stubborn part of me kept trying to find a version of the math where I could give everyone what they wanted and still feel like myself afterward. I never found one. I've come to believe that's because it doesn't exist, not because I didn't look hard enough. I lost weight that spring without trying to. The specific, unglamorous way grief and stress take weight off a body, rather than the way magazine covers imply. Carol noticed before I did and started leaving containers of soup on my porch some evenings without calling first, which I understood, even at the time, as its own quiet form of the exact thing I was trying to teach Trent. That you can take care of someone without asking their permission first, as long as what you're offering is genuinely theirs to accept or decline, a bowl of soup, rather than somebody else's inheritance. I also, for the first time in years, started sleeping with my phone in another room, a habit Trent had always found faintly insulting when I did it during arguments early in our marriage, back before we'd learned to fight in whispers instead. That spring it wasn't about him specifically, it was about learning slowly that I was allowed to be unreachable sometimes. That not every family emergency required my immediate, midnight availability, that some problems could genuinely wait until morning, without the entire structure of the family collapsing overnight. The divorce mediation itself happened over 3 separate sessions in a conference room that could have belonged to any law firm in America. Beige walls, a box of tissues on this table too, a pitcher of water nobody ever seemed to actually drink from. Our mediator, a soft-spoken man named Harold Beckett, who'd clearly done this several thousand times before, had a habit of restating whatever either of us said in slightly more neutral language, which was occasionally maddening and occasionally exactly what the room needed. "So you're saying," he told Trent during the second session, after Trent had spent several minutes explaining why he thought some portion of the trust income should factor into spousal support calculations even though the trust itself would remain entirely separate property, "that you believe your years of financial contribution to the marriage should be weighed against the fact that your wife's father chose to protect those specific assets?" "That's not—" Trent stopped. "Yes, I guess that is what I'm saying." "Accurate?" "It's accurate that he's saying it. I don't agree with the underlying premise." Harold nodded and wrote something down, unhurried, the way Preston always was too. In the end, the settlement wasn't dramatic. Wisconsin is a marital property state, so the house, our joint retirement accounts built up over the marriage, our savings, all of it split close to evenly, the way the law generally expects. The trust never entered into it at all, exactly as my father had designed it to. Trent kept his car, I kept the house, buying out his half with money entirely separate from the inheritance, because I wanted there to be no ambiguity, ever, about which dollars had paid for which walls. The $6,500 lake property deposit came back to our joint account 4 days after Trent canceled the contract, and we split it down the middle without either of us saying a word about it, which felt, by that point in the process, almost absurdly civil compared to everything that had come before. Trent found another sales job after about 8 weeks. It paid considerably less than his old one and required more driving, not less. When he told me, I said, "I'm glad." He gave me a crooked smile. Not exactly the retirement package I had in mind. A few months earlier, that comment would have started a fight. This time he added before I could say anything back, "I know, nobody's fault but mine." Paula stayed in her rental. She renewed for another year, after negotiating a smaller increase with her landlord than the one she'd originally been quoted. Preston, of all people, had quietly pointed her toward a tenants' rights clinic downtown when I mentioned she was worried, which had nothing to do with the trust and everything to do with him simply being a decent man. Paula and I still see each other now, which surprised both of us, I think. Not as mother and daughter-in-law anymore exactly. That specific shape of the relationship ended along with the marriage, but as two women who'd known each other for 24 years and found, once the dust settled, that they still had genuine affection left over for one another underneath everything. She still makes that ridiculous cranberry salad every Thanksgiving, and she still brings it to my house instead of Trent's, which he's never once complained about. At least not to me. We don't discuss the condo. We don't discuss the year my father died. We talk about her garden, and about Sophie, and about a British murder mystery show we both got hooked on independently, and discovered, almost by accident, we were both watching. Jenna took a full-time position with an established design firm in Madison and started working through her actual debts with a real repayment plan. The kind that takes years instead of a single windfall afternoon. Nobody ended up destitute. Nobody lost a home. The catastrophe everyone had spent that first terrible week preparing me to prevent turned out to be, in the end, ordinary life. Bills, jobs, rent, the same things everybody else deals with, the same things they would have dealt with whether or not my father had ever built a single fire suppression company. Trent and I started counseling separately at first. Later we went together. I won't pretend therapy produced some cinematic breakthrough where he said exactly the right thing and I suddenly understood 24 years of marriage in a single session. Mostly it was uncomfortable, the way honest conversations tend to be when you've spent decades avoiding them. One afternoon our counselor asked Trent why he'd been so certain I would eventually agree to his plans. He sat with that for a long time. Then he said, "Because she always came around." I looked at him. "No," he said, and turned toward me. I usually gave in. There wasn't much left to say to that. I'd spent years calling that compromise. Sometimes it genuinely was. Sometimes I'd come to understand, it very much wasn't. It was in that same session, a few minutes later, that I finally told him what I'd overheard that first week. "I heard you on the phone with Jenna that night. Nora will come around." He went very still. "You heard that?" "Every word." He sat with it for a moment. I think that might be the single most honest thing I said the entire spring, and I didn't even mean for anyone to hear it. Why do you say that? Because it wasn't really about the money in that sentence, it was about 24 years of evidence. I said it because it had always worked before. He looked at me. I wasn't wrong to expect it, Nora. That's what scares me most looking back. I wasn't guessing. I was pattern matching. I didn't have an answer for that right away. He was right. And being right about something that painful doesn't make it easier to hear, even when you're the one who needed to hear it most. Trent brought up his father, unprompted, exactly once in those joint sessions, a few months into the process. Our counselor had asked him what enough would have actually looked like to him, if he'd been given the chance to define it honestly instead of simply reaching for whatever felt largest and safest in the moment. He was quiet for a long time, then he said, "I don't think I've ever actually known the answer to that. I think I just knew what not enough looked like, because I grew up watching it. I never built a version of enough that didn't involve somebody else's money solving it for me." I didn't say anything. It wasn't my job, in that room, to forgive him for the observation, or to absolve him of it. But I recognized something true in it. And I think recognizing the truth in a thing, even when you're still angry about what it cost you, is its own kind of forward motion, whether or not it changes what you eventually decide to do about the marriage itself. Eventually Trent apologized without immediately explaining himself afterward, which mattered more than I expected it to. He said he was sorry he'd turned my father's death into a financial event before I'd even had time to properly grieve. He apologized for making promises on my behalf. He admitted quietly that he'd treated my eventual agreement as inevitable, the way you treat weather. I believed him. I also believed he was genuinely changing. But here is something I wish somebody had told me when I was younger. Somebody becoming better doesn't obligate you to go back to being the version of yourself who had to be hurt before they got there. After several more months, I asked for a legal separation. Later, we began the actual divorce process. It wasn't vicious. It wasn't painless either. The morning we signed the final decree, I remember it being unremarkable in a way I hadn't expected. No dramatic weather. No meaningful song on the radio during the drive over. Nothing that would have made a particularly satisfying detail in the telling of it. Just a clerk's office, with fluorescent lighting, a judge who processed roughly a dozen uncontested filings that same morning, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd clearly seen every possible variation of the same basic human failure to communicate, and 2 signatures on a page that officially ended something that had taken 24 years to build, and considerably less than 1% to genuinely dismantle. Trent squeezed my hand once, briefly on the courthouse steps afterward, and said, "Thank you for not making this into a war." "I never wanted a war," I told him. "I wanted to be asked." He nodded, like he finally fully understood the distinction. A little late, but not too late to matter for whatever came next in both of our lives separately. Around that same stretch, Sophie and I finally started clearing out my father's house. I'd put it off longer than I should have. One Saturday morning we stood in his kitchen surrounded by cardboard boxes and objects that felt somehow too ridiculous to simply throw away. My father had owned 4 tape measures. 4? Sophie held them up like evidence. Was Grandpa expecting a nationwide tape measure shortage? He didn't trust the one in the garage. Why? It lied to him once. She looked at me. I don't know what that means either. We laughed. It was the first time I'd laughed inside that house since he died. There was no final secret waiting in a drawer. No dramatic letter we'd somehow overlooked. Just Dad, hardware store receipts, 3 pairs of reading glasses he swore he'd only needed 1 of, an old coffee maker I'd tried unsuccessfully to replace twice over the years, measurements scribbled on the back of an envelope for shelves he'd clearly planned to build, and never gotten around to. There's one object from that garage I want to tell you about specifically, because it mattered more to me that year than almost anything with a dollar figure attached to it. My father kept a cheap plastic level, the kind you'd buy for $8 at any hardware store, on the dashboard of every truck he ever owned, going back to a Ford he drove in the 70s. He used to say a man who trusted his own eyes over an actual measurement was a man asking for a crooked shelf, and he applied that principle to considerably more than carpentry, though I didn't fully understand that until much later. In the same drawer as the tape measures, we found 4 of those levels, still in their original cardboard packaging, unopened, bought at various points over the years to replace ones that had presumably worn out or gone missing. I kept one. It sits on my own kitchen windowsill now, not because I have any particular carpentry to do, but because I like having it there. A small, cheap, stubbornly literal reminder that a thing can look level to the naked eye and still not actually be level at all, and that the only way to really know the difference is to check. I think about that level almost as often as I think about the investment plan document with my name typed into it 14 times. My marriage looked level to me for a very long time. It wasn't. I simply hadn't been in the habit of checking. Sophie was wrapping coffee mugs in newspaper when she asked, "Do you think Grandpa knew Dad would do all this?" I thought about it. No. She looked genuinely surprised. Really? I think he was worried. I folded another box flat. There's a difference. My father hadn't known my marriage better than I did. He hadn't set some elaborate trap for Trent to fall into. He'd noticed something that troubled him, and he'd arranged his estate so that I wouldn't have to make permanent, irreversible decisions under pressure while I was too raw to see clearly. That was all it had ever really been. It turned out to be enough. I have a friend named Carol Vance, known her since our kids were in the same kindergarten class more than 20 years ago now, and she's the person I told everything the morning after I overheard Trent on the phone in the den. We sat at her kitchen table, and Carol did something I've never forgotten. She didn't tell me what to do. She didn't say leave him or give him a chance, or any of the easy things people say when they want an uncomfortable conversation to feel resolved faster than it actually can. She just asked me one question. "When's the last time Trent asked you what you wanted and actually waited to hear the answer before deciding what happened next?" I sat with that longer than I wanted to admit, coffee going cold in my hands. "I don't remember," I finally said. "That's your answer," Carol told me. "Not to whether you leave him, to whether something's actually been off here a lot longer than 3 days." I thought about that conversation more than almost anything else that whole year. Carol never once told me what to decide. She just made sure I kept asking myself the right question, which turns out to be a rarer and more valuable kind of friendship than the kind that simply hands you an opinion. I should tell you a little more about my father, too, because he's mostly been a voice in a letter and a number on a balance sheet so far in this telling, and he deserves better than that from his own daughter. Emmett Bellamy started what would eventually become Bellamy Fire and Safety in a rented garage bay in 1979, installing sprinkler systems in strip malls and small manufacturing plants around the county, and he built it, slowly and stubbornly, into a company that eventually handled fire suppression contracts for half the commercial buildings in 3 counties. He married my mother, Ruth, young, and they stayed married 39 years. Until ovarian cancer took her when I was 29. Dad never remarried. He told me once, years later, half joking and half not, that he'd already used up his one good idea when he married her, and he didn't see the point of gambling on a second. He wasn't a soft man exactly. He didn't say I love you often, though he said it every single time I hung up the phone with him, without fail, for my entire adult life. Which I only fully appreciated after there were no more phone calls left to have. What he was, more than anything, was careful. He read every contract twice. He kept receipts for things he'd bought decades earlier, in case he ever needed to prove he'd paid for them. He distrusted anyone who was in a hurry to get his signature on something, a habit I now understand he built the hard way, from a business partner who'd shortchanged him badly in the company's early years, a story he only ever told me once, at my mother's funeral of all places, apropos of absolutely nothing. The way grief sometimes loosens a person's grip on which stories are supposed to stay buried. I think that partner is the real reason the trust exists in the shape it does. My father didn't distrust Trent out of nowhere. He recognized, in Trent's easy confidence about my inheritance, an old shape he'd seen exactly once before, decades earlier, wearing a different face. I think about my parents' marriage a great deal now, in a way I never used to, before any of this happened. My mother worked as a school librarian for most of her adult life, a modest, steady income next to my father's growing business, and I never once, in 29 years of watching them together, saw my father make a significant decision without her at the table for it. I used to think that was simply how their generation did things, old-fashioned in a comforting sort of way. I understand now that it wasn't old-fashioned at all. It was a specific, deliberate choice my father made over and over, for 39 years. And it's the reason he recognized so quickly, watching Trent, what a marriage looks like when that choice stops being made. My mother told me once, not long before she died, that the secret to their marriage wasn't that they never disagreed. It was that neither of them ever assumed, going into a hard conversation, that they already knew how it was going to end. "Your father always left room for me to surprise him," she said. "Even after 30 years, he never once decided in advance what I'd say." I didn't understand what she meant, not really. until I was sitting across from Trent at my own kitchen table with an investment plan between us that had already decided, 9 months in advance, exactly what I would eventually agree to. I run a physical therapy practice with 2 other partners, on the north side of town, and I want to mention it here because somewhere in that first terrible week, I noticed something small about myself that I'm not particularly proud of. When Trent said your inheritance is enough for both of us, part of what stung, underneath the grief and the disbelief, was that he'd erased an entire career I'd built over 26 years without seeming to notice he was doing it. I had built something too. It wasn't Bellamy Fire and Safety. It employed 4 people, not 40. But I had built it, hour by hour, patient by patient, starting in a rented suite above a dry cleaner in 1998. And Trent's plan for our future didn't have a single line in it for whether I might want to keep doing the work I'd spent half my life becoming good at. I didn't quit. I want to say that plainly, because people sometimes assume that's how these stories end. The wife discovers she's wealthy and walks away from her whole former life in one grand gesture. I went back to the practice the Monday after the funeral. My patients didn't know what my father had left me, and I preferred it that way. There was something steadying about spending an hour helping a 68-year-old man regain enough range of motion in his shoulder to reach his own top cabinet shelf again, something that had nothing to do with trusts, or corporate trustees or investment plans with my name typed into them 14 separate times. I have a patient at the practice, an 81-year-old retired schoolteacher named Mr. Osei, who I'd been seeing twice a week for a knee replacement recovery since around the time all of this started, and he asked me once, months in, whether I was going through something difficult because he said I'd gotten quieter with my patients that spring, less prone to the small talk I usually filled sessions with. I told him, in the vaguest possible terms, that my father had died, and my marriage was ending, and he nodded like he'd suspected as much, and then he said something I've carried with me since. The hardest year of my life, he told me, working through a set of leg extensions, was the year I finally stopped explaining myself to people who'd already decided what I owed them. Took me until I was almost 70 to manage it. You're getting there a lot younger than I did. I've thought about Mr. Osei's knee, oddly enough, almost as often as I've thought about my father's letter. Recovery from an injury like his isn't linear either. Some weeks the range of motion improves, some weeks it plateaus, or even briefly regresses. And the work is simply to keep showing up for the next session regardless. Trusting that the overall direction is sound, even when any single week doesn't feel like proof of it. I met the corporate trustee only once in person, a measured, unhurried woman named Diane Abernathy from a firm in Milwaukee, when Preston and I drove up to discuss the eventual structure of distributions once the first 5 years passed. She reviewed my father's letter with a kind of careful professional neutrality that I found oddly comforting. Your father wasn't trying to control you from beyond the grave, she told me near the end of that meeting. Men who want control write trusts that never end. He wrote one that expires in 5 years. That's not control, that's a timer. I asked Preston once why he'd taken such obvious personal care with my father's specific concerns, instead of simply drafting a standard trust and moving on to his next appointment. He told me, a little reluctantly, that he'd watched his own mother remarry at 71, quickly and happily, to a man who turned out to have 3 ex-wives and a habit of helping himself to whatever savings he could access within 18 months of any new relationship. Preston's mother had lost most of what she had before the family caught it, and Preston, then a young associate at a different firm entirely, had felt for years afterward that he should have seen it coming and hadn't. I don't build a fence around every client's money, he told me. Most people don't need one. Your father wasn't most people's kind of worried. He was worried the way a man gets worried after he's already watched something like this happen once, secondhand, to somebody he cared about. He paused. I asked him about that actually, the day he signed the trust. He told me a story about a business partner from decades earlier that I suspect you've heard some version of yourself by now. I had. It was strange. Hearing the same shape of storyland twice, once from my father, and once from his lawyer, decades apart, describing 2 completely different men who'd each, in their own way, decided that trust was something you extended carefully rather than something you simply assumed. I thought about that phrase, a timer, for a long time afterward. It was exactly right. My father hadn't tried to run my life from a grave in a cemetery outside town. He'd simply bought me 5 years of not having to decide anything permanent while I was still too close to the fire to see the shape of the room. There was a night, about 6 weeks after Trent moved out, when I came closer than I'd like to admit to undoing all of it. He'd called, upset about something small and unrelated, a flat tire, a bad week at the new job, and some old, well-worn part of me wanted nothing more than to tell him to come home, to split the $6,500 back out of savings, and just buy the lake property after all, to make everyone comfortable again, the way I'd spent 24 years making everyone comfortable. Because comfortable had always felt, to me, indistinguishable from loved. I sat in my car in my own driveway for almost 20 minutes with the engine off, phone in my lap, genuinely deciding. What stopped me in the end wasn't Preston, or the trustee, or even my father's letter. It was Carol's question, the one she'd asked me at her kitchen table weeks earlier, running through my head on a loop. When's the last time he asked what you wanted and actually waited for the answer? I still didn't have a good answer to that question, and until I did, I understood. Going back would only teach him the same lesson I'd been teaching him, in smaller doses for over 2 decades. I didn't call him back that night. I went inside and made myself dinner, alone, and ate it slowly, at my own kitchen table, for probably the first time in longer than I could remember. I didn't do anything particularly exciting with the inheritance, in the end. Sorry to disappoint anyone hoping I bought a convertible and moved to the Amalfi Coast. I strengthened my own retirement accounts, the ones I'd been funding modestly for years on a physical therapist's income. I worked with Preston and a financial advisor to make sure my housing was secure once the divorce finalized. Most of it stayed invested, exactly the way my father had it invested, because he'd been right about almost everything else, and I saw no particular reason to assume he'd been wrong about that too. I set up a modest education fund for any grandchildren I might have someday, though Sophie will tell you, if you ask her, that I brought this up roughly 4 years before it was in any way relevant to her life. Sophie and Julian got engaged the following spring, a full 18 months after everything with Trent and me had settled into its new, quieter shape. She called to tell me before she told her father, which I understood, even as it happened, to be its own small, deliberate statement about which of us she trusted to receive the news without immediately calculating what it might cost. Julian asked her at the overlook above the lake where we used to take her camping as a girl, and when she described it to me over the phone, laughing and crying at the same time, I found myself thinking, unexpectedly, of my own father, of the version of him that would have loved nothing more than driving up for the weekend just to hear the story told in person. Twice, the way he always wanted everything important told to him. He never got to meet Julian. That's one of the smaller griefs tucked inside the larger one, the kind that catches you off guard on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. All the future ordinary moments a person doesn't get, folded inside the one enormous moment everyone remembers to grieve. I made a donation to the community college scholarship fund my father had quietly supported for nearly 20 years without ever once mentioning it to me. I only found out about it going through his files, a stack of canceled checks going back to 2006, each one for the same modest amount, made out every single September like clockwork. Later I gave Sophie some money toward a down payment on her first house. But before I did, we sat down together, just the two of us, at my kitchen table. How much? Why? What expectations come with it? None. As it happened, that particular conversation lasted about 20 minutes, start to finish. It may have been the healthiest financial transaction anybody in my entire family managed to complete all year. When the trust's 5-year restriction finally lifted, long after the divorce had finalized, long after Sophie's down payment, long after most of this had settled into simple history rather than open wound, Diane Abernathy called me one last time, mostly as a courtesy, to formally close out her role as co-trustee. "Your father would be pleased," she told me, in the same measured, unhurried voice she'd used at our very first meeting. "Not because of any particular number, because you made every decision in these 5 years, like a person who actually wanted to make it, rather than a person being managed toward an outcome." I asked her before we hung up how many families she'd seen where the story went the other way, where the protected spouse simply waited out the restriction and handed everything over the moment the timer ran out, exactly as the entitled party had assumed all along. "More than you'd think," she said. "It's not really about the legal structure in the end. The structure only ever buys time. What people do with that time is entirely up to them." The final divorce paperwork took longer than either Trent or I expected. These things always seem to, no matter how amicable the two people signing them are trying to be. When we met to sign one of the last sets of documents, we got coffee together afterward. That probably sounds strange. 24 years doesn't simply evaporate because a pair of attorneys put sticky tabs on a stack of forms. Trent stirred his coffee for a while without drinking any of it. Then he said, "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I'd just stayed at work?" I thought about it honestly before answering. Maybe we'd still be married. He looked at me. But the problem would still be there. What problem? I said it as gently as I could manage. You thought being my husband gave you ownership over things that belonged to me. He looked down into his cup. The money, I added, just made it expensive enough for me to finally notice. Trent nodded slowly. I wish I'd noticed first. So do I. We finished our coffee. Then we hugged briefly in the parking lot and walked to 2 separate cars. I never did find out what happened to that pontoon boat listing Trent had open on his laptop the morning I first left for Preston's office. I thought about asking him once, months later, mostly out of a strange detached curiosity rather than anything more pointed. I decided against it. Some questions, I've learned, aren't actually about the answer. They're about whether you still need to ask them. And by the time I might have asked that one, I found I genuinely didn't. I want to be honest that none of my own healing followed any kind of clean timeline either, the same way none of Trent's did. There were mornings, well over a year after my father died, when I'd reach for my phone out of pure muscle memory to call him about something trivial. A strange noise in the car, a form I couldn't make sense of, before remembering, all over again, that the number I still hadn't deleted from my favorites would simply ring and ring in an empty house that wasn't even mine to sell yet. My grief counselor told me, during one of our last sessions, that people often expect grief to resolve the way a wound does, steadily, visibly, in a direction you can track. She said it's closer, in her experience, to weather. Some seasons are worse than others. Some days arrive sunny for no particular reason, and other days arrive dark for no particular reason either, and eventually you simply learn to keep a coat by the door, instead of waiting for the season to change permanently. I've kept that coat by the door, metaphorically speaking, for a long time now. I expect I'll be keeping it there for a good while longer. For a long time I assumed my father's final gift to me was $4.2 million. It wasn't. The most valuable thing he actually left me was time, because without that trust standing quietly between me and everyone's expectations, I know exactly what would have happened instead. Trent would have apologized sincerely, the way he's genuinely capable of. Paula would have cried about her lease. Jenna would have explained, in careful detail, exactly how badly she needed the money, and I would have looked at the numbers involved and told myself there was plenty to go around for everyone, including me. I would have given in, not because I wanted to, in my heart, but because somewhere along the way, across 2.5 decades, I had quietly started confusing keeping everybody comfortable with being a good wife. I've become, in the time since, considerably more like my father than I ever expected to be. I read contracts twice now, even simple ones. I ask more questions before agreeing to things. Even small things, even when asking feels, for half a second, like more trouble than it's worth. Sophie teases me about it sometimes, gently, the same way I imagine I once might have teased my own father for keeping 4 tape measures in a drawer just in case one of them lied to him again. I understand him so much better now than I did while he was alive to explain himself. I wish that particular kind of understanding hadn't required losing him to arrive at. But grief, I've learned, has a way of finally translating a language you'd been hearing your whole life without ever quite learning to speak yourself. I think back sometimes to that Tuesday morning, 10:30, walking into my own kitchen and finding my husband in his sweatpants with a laptop open to a boat he had no business shopping for. I didn't know, standing in that doorway with one hand still on the frame, that I was about to spend the better part of a year learning the difference between a man who loves you and a man who has simply never once been told no by you. I know it now. I think in some strange way, I owe both my father and my husband for that particular education, though I doubt either of them would recognize the debt described quite that way. 3 days after my father died, my husband quit his job because he believed my inheritance meant neither of us would ever have to work again. He was wrong. Trent went back to work, and in a strange, roundabout way, so did I. Except the particular job I finally quit that year was one I'd been working, unpaid and mostly unnoticed, for 24 straight years. Smoothing things over, giving in, pretending that keeping the peace was the same thing as being respected. If you've ever had to learn the difference between those two things for yourself, You probably already understand exactly why it took me this long.